I'm listed as talking about Vietnam War literature, but I thought I'd expand it and talk about how American culture, movies, books, and music responded to the war, and that's why John Wells is gracing us on stage today. I thought about writing this in ballad form and singing my presentation, but so the title is The American War because, as you'll see when I go through this presentation, most depictions of the war from the American perspective are really concerned about America, not about the Vietnamese, not about what's happening there, but about a struggle in interpretations of the war within America. The first significant literary text about the war was Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American, which was also made into a movie. This book is sort of a tug of war between three characters: a middle-aged British journalist, Thomas Fowler, his Vietnamese mistress, Phuong, and a young Ivy League-educated diplomat and covert agent, Alden Pyle. In the course of the novel, Fowler discovers that Pyle is pretty much an ideologue, a believer in what he identifies as a third way between colonialism and capitalism, colonialism and communism, and believes in American exceptionalism. And he believes it to such an extent that he takes part in a bombing that kills some innocent people. Fowler is upset about this and reveals Pyle's presence to the communists, and Pyle, the American, is executed, hence the title, The Quiet American. A few years later, there was a book that was in some ways a response called The Ugly American, which was also made into a movie, unsuccessful movie, but a highly successful book. The book is sort of a series of vignettes set in a country called Sarkan, but which is obviously supposed to be Vietnam, and it details engage with the culture, whereas the American ambassador is a political appointee who knows nothing about the culture, is uninterested in it, doesn't speak the language. Luckily, our diplomatic corps is much different nowadays. So the premise of the book is, I know you're all waiting for John to sing, sorry. The premise of the book is that America is exceptional. It does have the ability to successfully fight against communism in the Cold War, but its practices are unsuccessful. It needs to change to recognize cultural diversity. Part of the book, too, deals with covert warfare, guerrilla warfare. The novel, many of you maybe have heard this phrase, but have never read the book. It was hugely influential, a bestseller. John F. Kennedy, when he was a senator, bought copies of the book and gave a copy to every other senator. When he became president, some of the policies that he implemented, like the development of the Peace Corps, in some ways was inspired by this book. Kennedy was also a big fan of the Green Beret, who they existed before he became president, but they'd been sort of marginalized. They weren't even allowed to wear the Green Beret anymore. And Kennedy rescinded that. They could wear the Green Beret, and he started sending those special forces to Vietnam. So, by 1965, the war has taken off. LBJ is president. There's 185,000 Americans in Vietnam. The U.S. has started its bombing campaign in Vietnam, and the culture begins to respond, part of the culture anyway, with protesting the war. You can see it a lot in folk music of the time. Bob Dylan's Masters of War was written the year before this, and John will sing a little of Barry McGuire for us. I was hoping John would dress in this attire, but so obviously this is a very pessimistic song, height of the Cold War. This song was the #1 hit. The songwriter, by the way, also wrote A Secret Agent Man. Footnote. This song came out the year after the movies Failsafe and Dr. Strangelove, so it has that sense of gloom and despair about the Cold War. It does reference, seemingly, Vietnam in the first line, the Eastern world is exploding. It has that common lament from the 1960s that we're old enough to get drafted at 18, but we can't vote until we're 21. There was an almost immediate response to The Eve of Destruction by a one-hit group called The Spokesmen, called The Dawn of Correction, which is an almost word-by-word or line-by-line response to this, to The Eve of Destruction. This song was not as popular, but it did enter the top 40. Play out just a little bit for you. Oh well. It worked in rehearsal. So I do have a few, it's too bad too, because I was hoping that you could get up and dance to this. So I do have a couple of lyrics written down here from their song. Their song begins, "The Western world has a common destination to keep people free from red domination." It goes on in later verses to say things like, "Several governments replacing colonization. What about the Peace Corps organization? Don't forget the work of the United Nations." So it was a direct response. I know now the naivete seems funny, but it had that sense of sort of JFK-like idealism and the belief that, yes, we can solve the problems of the world, this kind of belief in American exceptionalism. I hope this music works. So the next significant work of the literature about the war, I don't know if I call it literature, but fiction, is The Green Beret by Robin Moore. It was a very popular book with a paperback cover, had the picture of Barry Sadler. Barry Sadler is in the center of the screen. He wrote the song, The Ballad of the Green Beret, which was a #1 hit, and this surprised me, was the best-selling song of 1966. It sold more copies than any song by the Beatles or Stones. It sold more copies than Good Vibrations or California Dreamin' or You Can't Hurry Love. And so we'll see if this one works today. I was hoping that you would sing along, but so it's interesting thinking about this song as being a #1 song in 1966, because when we look back on the 60s, right, we tend to think of the protest movement as being the dominant mode of discourse and a dominant political belief, but there was a pretty significant cultural struggle going on. This is a pretty standard patriotic song celebrating the virtues of masculinity and of these skilled and successful warriors. The song ends where the soldier has been killed. "Back at home, a young wife waits. Her green beret has met his fate. He has died for those oppressed, leaving her this last request. Put silver wings on my son's chest. Make him one of America's best. He'll be a man they'll test one day. Have him win the Green Beret." So if you had a popular book and a popular movie, Hollywood is obviously going to take advantage of this. In 1968, the movie The Green Beret came out, starring John Wayne, co-directed by John Wayne. The movie was a modest commercial success. It was 13th in the year in box office receipts. The #1 movie of 1968 was 2001: A Space Odyssey. In case you're interested, other movies that made more money were Rosemary's Baby, Night of the Living Dead, Funny Girl, what else? Lion in Winter, Romeo and Juliet. It was a good year for movies. But this movie, like I said, was a modest commercial success, but was a critical failure. And I'll read a little quote from Renata Adler, who was the movie critic for the New York Times. She said about The Green Beret, "The Green Beret is a film so unspeakable, so stupid, so rotten and false in every detail that it passes through being fun, through being funny, through being camp, through everything, and becomes an invitation to grieve for what has happened to the fantasy-making apparatus in the country." So with that as a build, as a lead-in, I'll show you. This is the final scene of the movie. And there's a notorious gaffe here, or flub of some kind. See if you could detect it. So one of my goals of this talk is to make sure that when you leave this auditorium today, you can't get that damn song out of your head. Does anybody catch what the flaw is here? It actually refers to geography. What's that? Yeah, the Vietnam only has an east coast. There's no setting sun off the coast of Vietnam. This is obviously filmed, in California. The film was, when it was played in Vietnam, the soldiers laughed at it, right? It was ridiculous. It was basically a World War II movie imposed upon a much more complex and ambiguous dynamic. The end here, I think, the way that I read it is paternalistic America, right, going to save the Vietnamese people. There's also a sense here of a movie that's aimed at young Americans, right? Let's get them to have this sensibility and eventually volunteer or serve in the military. And I mention that because in a lot of Vietnam War autobiographies, soldiers talk about how influential, not this movie, but earlier John Wayne movies were World War II movies, and telling them this is what war is like, I should be willing to sacrifice and things. And in fact, in Vietnam, to act like John Wayne, to John Wayne something was an insult. It was to be stupidly heroic. Okay. And that takes us to some more music. So before you get started on this, let me give a little preface. So there's much, there's not another film made about the Vietnam War by a major Hollywood studio during the Vietnam War. The Green Beret is the only one. There's no television entertainment programs that are covering the war. It was an escapist TV fare like Gilligan's Island and I Dream of Jeannie. The only show that really dealt with the military in a contemporary military during the 60s was Gomer Pyle USMC. I don't think there's any indication that Gomer Pyle USMC might become Gomer Pyle KIA. So it was left to popular music, where this contest over visions of the war and visions of America played out. And it was a pretty simple divide: rock, soul, pop music on one side, and country music on the other. Country music was where the war was defended, where patriotism was sung about, and John will sing a little bit from Merle Haggard for us. First, we're going to do his most famous hit is "Okie from Muskogee," right? Which some of you probably know. He criticizes the left, right, the hippie culture, and defends country values. And then you can do "Fighting Side of Me," right? Okay. We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee. We don't take our trips on LSD. We don't run draft calls down on Main Street. just want to say, so John gets applause every time he sings. I'm making brilliant points up here. And great. So what's interesting about this, first of all, those two songs were hugely popular. They're both #1 country songs. The former, Okie from Muskogee, won Country Music Award Single of the Year. The album won Album of the Year, so they were hugely popular in country music. But this, it's interesting in this song because by '69, this is the year after the Tet Offensive, it's hard to look optimistically at the war and place it in traditional sort of martial perspective. Earlier country songs did do that. There was a song from 1965 called What We're Fighting For, whose lyrics said, "Tell them we're fighting for the old red, white, and blue. Did they forget Pearl Harbor and Korea too? Another flag must never fly above our nation's door. Oh, mama, tell them what we're fighting for." By this point, even a country musician like Merle Haggard can't come up with that kind of sentiment. So instead, this is the way I interpret the song, the kind of frustration over the conduct of the war, right, gets channeled into an anger at people who are protesting the war, and pointedly their hypocrisy in the last verse up there, right? They are safe, they're secure, they're prosperous, but they don't, they're squirrely and ignoring their duty to country, which is a tradition in this kind of music. So if country music was taking this side and criticizing the anti-war movement, we did have songs from the other side, obviously anti-war songs, and John will sing this one for us. So obviously the hypocrisy that's addressed in this song, right, is of people, fortunate people, wealthy people, powerful people who use patriotism to exploit the working class who are fighting and dying in the war. That was the nature of the draft, right? There's a really convincing book called Working Class War, which makes that argument that the war was fought and people died based on class. And you can see some, it's pretty obvious in this song, right? Some folks inherit star-spangled eyes. They're born with this kind of blind patriotism. They are unwilling to sacrifice, right? When the taxman comes to the door, they're hiding their wealth, but they will want more and more from you, right? More willingness to die to keep them in wealth and power. Okay. So, change of pace here. I said that The Green Beret was the only mainstream Hollywood movie about the Vietnam War that was made during the war. There were some exploitation films. I don't have anything to say about these. I just like having a poster of chrome and hot leather. I do like the Don't Muck Around with the Green Beret's Mama. Total change of gear here. The next major film that came out about the Vietnam War was the documentary Hearts and Minds. I don't know how many of you heard of it. It was got a little release when it first came out, but it was surprise winner for best documentary feature. I'll show you a little trailer of it in a second. It's interesting when it won. This was after Saigon had fallen, and the director Peter Davis went up and accepted the Academy Award, and he read a telegram from the communist ambassador thanking the anti-war movement for contributing to the end of the war. Behind stage, Bob Hope and several others instantly scribbled together a response, and Frank Sinatra read it saying that the views of Peter Davis and the Vietnamese communists do not reflect those of the motion picture arts and what do you get? So here's a little preview, trailer.
The communist conspiracy is a deliberate and predictable plan of action to subvert the world.
There are those who ask why this responsibility should be ours. The answer, I think, is simple. There is no one else who can do the job.
We began to feel the sense of a world power, that possibly we could control the future of the world.
We don't see the end of the tunnel, but I must say I don't think it's darker than it was a year ago in some ways like
Throughout the war, Vietnam, the United States has exercised a degree of restraint unprecedented in the annals of war.
The Latin America.
500,000 of them in Vietnam, and this war became a war of genocide.
Americans say the Vietnamese are just land-eye savages. The Vietnamese have 5,000 years of history. We fight against the invaders. It is not we who are the savages.
I know very little about it over there, I'll tell you. And the less I know, the better off I'll be. I don't even know who we're fighting for over there, to be real honest with you. I think we're fighting for the North Vietnamese, ain't we? How do I feel when the war was over? I felt real good. And that was our #1 ambition. That's what we really wanted, was to win this war. It took us a long time. So when it was finally over, when we knew that we had won, we felt great. We really felt great.
I think the Americans have worked extremely hard not to see the criminality their officials and their policymakers have exhibited.
Make no mistake about it. We are going to win.
The history of conflict among nations does not record another such lengthy and consistent chronicle of error as we have shown in Vietnam.
The Vietnamese fight only in self-defense. Ultimately, the Americans will see the light. If not, they will defeat themselves.
So if you haven't heard of this movie, Hearts and Minds, it's really worth seeing. As you can tell, it's highly polemical, right? It has its definite point of view, but unlike most representations of the Vietnam War in American culture, it does focus significantly on the plight of the Vietnamese. There's a scene towards the end of the movie which is almost unwatchable, in which General William Westmoreland, who is the leader of the American Armed Forces in Vietnam, says Orientals don't have the same respect for human life as Westerners, and they follow that with a scene of a Vietnamese mother wailing over the death of her son. She's literally trying to climb into the grave with his body. So anyway, it's highly worth seeing. So by the mid-1970s, books, movies begin to depict the war. Right? It's after the war that people are remembering the war, trying to fashion our sense of what the war was like. Some of you might have heard of this before. The Born on the Fourth of July was made into a popular movie starring Tom Cruise. The author is Ron Kovic. He volunteered for the Marine Corps. He was shot in Vietnam and paralyzed. And the book details his experiences after Vietnam, but it also talks about before Vietnam. He was literally born on the 4th of July. He grew up in, I think, on Long Island. He was a patriot. He was a Yankees fan. He loved John Wayne movies and was inspired by them to join the Marine Corps. The book is really a kind of political education of how someone starts off that way, experiences the war, turns anti-war, and becomes a leading voice in the Vietnam veterans against the war. This is a movie that was immensely popular when it came out. It was directed by Hal Ashby. I'll show you a little trailer for this. Jane Fonda was a primary motivator in this film. She had read Born on the 4th of July, was inspired by it, and so the movie itself is inspired by that book to some degree. This movie, you'll see from the trailer, like The Quiet American, it focuses on a triangle, a tug of war between two men and a woman. Jane Fonda is a kind of 1950s-ish housewife. She's married to Bruce Dern, who's a Marine Corps officer. He goes off to Vietnam, and while he's away, she meets and falls in love with a paralyzed veteran played by Jon Voight. The movie makers, it's not exactly an equal struggle here between Jon Voight and Bruce Dern, if you know about those actors. Jon Voight was in Midnight Cowboy. He had just come off a movie called Conrack, where he played as kind of savior white teacher in an all-black school on the coast of South Carolina. Meanwhile, Bruce Dern was known for his psychopathic roles. He killed John Wayne in The Cowboys. He was the mad scientist in The Incredible Two-Headed Transplant, which I might be the only person in this room to have seen. Okay. So, thank you. I'm going to skip the love scene here. I have limited time.
She's here because she loves you. It's true what he's saying, Bob. Don't tell me that, Jane Fonda, Jon Voight, Bruce Dern, and Jerome Cohen production.
Okay. So you get the sense of this film. Again, it's depicting this struggle, right? This internecine struggle in the U.S. between pro-war, anti-war, pro-military, anti-military, between versions of America. This kind of internal struggle reaches its apotheosis, I think, in the movie Platoon, directed by Oliver Stone, who was the first Vietnam War veteran to direct a major Hollywood movie. It gets high marks from veterans for its accurate depiction of the war, of what Vietnam was like, what combat was like for ground troops. But the movie is really about, not in my eyes anyway, not so much about Vietnam, but about this struggle between visions of America. On the one side, you have the Tom Berenger character, playing Sergeant Barnes, scar-faced. He represents the sadistic, the racist, the immoral side of America, and actions in Vietnam. On the other side, Willem Dafoe playing Sergeant Elias, who is humane, compassionate, liberal, I guess, in that sense. And between them, this is also a tug of war, is Charlie Sheen's character, who's pulled on both sides in this conflict. The conflict, too, is in the movie is coded musically. There's a scene where Charlie Sheen goes with Tom Berenger's men in their barracks, and it's all white, and they're listening to country music. When he goes into the other side with Willem Dafoe's men, it's integrated, and they're listening to Motown. In the movie, Willem Dafoe eventually dies, thanks to Tom Berenger, so that you've got this kind of sense in which the Vietnam War is a kind of American tragedy, right? American innocence is at risk, is lost in this struggle. Probably the most influential literary text about the war is not remembered very much nowadays. It's Michael Hare's book, Dispatches. He was a journalist for Esquire magazine. And one of the reasons it was so influential was the aesthetic that he used, his literary aesthetic. So the novel is told, I mean, it's not a novel, it's his encounters with troops and these journalistic reports. It's nonlinear. He goes in various places. There's no sort of continuity in that way. It's often digressive. He'll talk about different aspects of American character or American policy or whatever seems to be appropriate. You can't tell that from the passage up here, but the style itself is kind of hyperbolic at times, rock and rollish, drug-induced. He was what was called the New Journalist, associated with people like Hunter S. Thompson and Tom Wolfe. The passage that I have up here is where he talks about the limitations of regular journalism in reporting the war. If you think about the Vietnam War, there is no sense, there's no front line, there's no sense really of winning battles. So that kind of, the nature of that war contributes to this, we need to do a new kind of aesthetic to reflect the war. And so at the end here he says, conventional journalism could no more reveal this war than conventional firepower could win it. All it could do was take the most profound event of the American decade and turn it into a communications pudding. Hare, besides writing this book, also was co-writer for several screenplays. He co-wrote the screenplay for Full Metal Jacket and the screenplay for Apocalypse Now. So I'm just going to show you one little scene from Full Metal Jacket by Stanley Kubrick.
Very alive. Right. Colonel? Green, what is that button on your body armor? The peace symbol, sir. Where'd you get it? I don't remember, sir. What is that you've got written on your helmet? Born to kill, sir. You write born to kill on your helmet and to wear a peace button. What's that supposed to be, some kind of signal? No, sir. What is it supposed to mean? I don't know, sir. You don't know very much, do you? No, sir. You might get your head and your ass wired together, or I will take your giant shit out. Yes, sir. Answer my question, or you'll be standing cold before the man. I think I was trying to suggest something about the duality of man, sir. What? The duality of man, the Jungian thing, sir. Whose side are you on? Our side, sir. You love your country? Yes, sir. How about getting with the program? Why don't you jump on the team and come on into the big win? Yes, sir. Somehow I've ever asked the Marines and for them to obey my orders and to work the word of God. We are here to help the Vietnamese because inside every group there is an American trying to get out. It's a hardball world, son. We've got to try to keep our heads until this peace craze goes over. Aye, aye, sir.
So in that officer's remarks, you can see the kind of contentless rhetoric of the war. Right? The journalists regularly called the press briefings the 5 o'clock follies because it was so filled with this kind of nonsense and so removed from reality. And I think you see here too in the soldier, what's the actor's name? I forgot. What is it? Yeah, Matthew Modine. Yeah, and so his approach to this, right, to the horrors of the war is just through absurdity, right? Just the only way to deal with this is through some kind of black comedy or some kind of recognition of how absurd the situation is. And you see that over and over again in literary representations of the war. We saw it in Coming Home. There's a focus on veteran. Things changed. This struggle that I was talking about between two versions of the war slowly starts to change as we move farther and farther away from the war, and the culture becomes more and more concerned with the plight of veterans. Two completely opposite veterans here. On this side, we have Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver, who most people don't remember, was a Vietnam veteran. And so a lot of movies and television shows in the 70s did tend to depict veterans that way, as potential psychopaths, potential killers. Over time, that got changed into the heroic veteran, right, who has been exploited and who is suffering. Here's a little clip from a movie from the 70s that will give you some of this psychopathic veteran view.
He's been away for 8 years. Now, he's coming home.
Speaking for myself, I'd like to say that the whole experience has made a better man, a better officer, and a better American out of me. Thank you very much.
But the world has changed.
I've been with another man.
You don't remember me, do you? And he's changed too.
Pull it up in the air like you're going to take me clear out of this.
Listen.
Higher, man, higher. This is a bone start. That's it. Higher.
What do you expect me to drop everything? What is wrong with you?
Driving too slow. It's going to take some time to readjust.
Your husband, he's got a whole bag of silver dollars if I don't do it. No, please don't.
She's the lips, a name, a face, an accent.
I can't just let it slide, man. It's not helping you have to live. There's a storm brewing in this man. They took his arm, they took his family, and his soul. His anger is building, and it's going to explode. Now, from Forrest Gump, the author of Taxi Driver, comes a new and shattering film about a man poised on the brink of violence. Rolling Thunder, starring William.
Okay. So again, it's about a veteran who comes home, right? In this case, his family is assaulted and killed, and he seeks revenge. I think you can read it as, culturally, as a soldier seeking revenge for what has happened to him in the war. In the movie, he loses his arm. The people who had come to his house, if I remember correctly, they put it down at a garbage disposal. And so but it's that sense of a veteran, right, thinly disguised rage, and the rage is going to be turned against people who caused him this damage, right? It's not directed against the government or the military. It's, you know, it's displaced that way, but that's the context, I think, of the film. So we begin to focus on the plight of veterans. The Deer Hunter is I assume many of you have seen this movie. That's the central focus of that film. A bunch of working class buddies go to Vietnam and they come back. They're forced when they're over there, several of them, to play Russian roulette. It traumatizes one of the main characters. And the film is all about the attempt to overcome this kind of psychological trauma from the war. By the time we reach the 1980s, this has become a common theme, right? We're focusing now on the plight of vets, and John will sing us a few songs here.
Born in the USA, I was born in the
So our speaker this morning was talking about how the nation needs to reconcile after war and how the North and South got together. I think in the case of the Vietnam War, reconciliation occurred this way. These opposing sides, and we're going to reconcile by both recognizing the suffering of the vets and how they were exploited. So we've got Springsteen's song here, which harkens back to Fortunate Son, the sense of working class person getting in a jam, having no choice, going off to fight in a seemingly racist war in the sense of fighting against the yellow man. Coming back, this is the Reagan era, the 1980s, with no jobs, deindustrialization. The Billy Joel song is about comradeship, two men meeting in boot camp, staying together in that horrible context. And then the Charlie Daniels song is interesting because it does have that sense, you know, it's about the suffering of a vet when he returns, right? He can't get away from Vietnam. It's still haunting him. And there is a sense, though, here, there's still a little bit of that anti-war movement, right? I could have gone to school, I could have gone to Canada, or I could have stayed in school, but as a country, you know, Southern person brought up on following rules and serving my country, I've gone off to fight. But generally, there's a sense of the country coming together with this stuff. And I know you don't think about this, but the veterans were all over the place on TV in the 1980s. Each one of these people on the screen, their backstory had them having served in Vietnam. There are several episodes of Magnum P.I. where he goes back to Vietnam. I think he has a wife that he left there or something. I never really watched the shows. I was more of a MacGyver man. So talking about veterans, the most, I think, interesting portrayal of veterans is in Bobby Ann Mason's novel In Country, which focuses on a character, Sam Hughes, an 18-year-old girl growing up in rural Kentucky. It's set in 1984. That's one of the early passages in the novel identifies the setting, the specific time period. Her father was killed before she was born in Vietnam. She's living with her uncle, who is a Vietnam veteran suffering from PTSD, and she's trying to make sense of herself and her place in the world and her community, and she's doing that by trying to understand the war. But she's limited in how she can do that. She's immersed in popular culture. This is the era of MTV. The novel's filled with references to music videos. I used to teach this novel, and my students loved it, but I think you'd have to annotate it thoroughly now to explain what 99 Luftballons refer to and things like that. It's really a terrific book, however. Mason's prose has been called Kmart realism or brand name realism because she does make all these references to the culture. It's interesting, too, I'm trying to race through this, sorry, that the culture, there's still a kind of cultural war going on here to some degree. She's living in rural Kentucky, but cable TV is kind of perceived as an invader, bringing us all these strange new things like Boy George and she sees like Pat Benatar videos and is giving her a different view of what a girl or a woman can be. In fact, the culture's response sees this as threatening. Her boyfriend's parents won't get cable TV because Showtime shows R-rated movies, and she makes reference at one point to the cable man's mailbox was blown up with a cherry bomb because it was seen as this kind of invasion of their cultural values being threatened. The novel ends with the characters going to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. There was a movie version of this. That's Bruce Willis, who plays the uncle that she lives with. The British actress Emily Lloyd plays Sam Hughes. At the end of the novel, she sees a soldier named Sam Hughes, his name on the memorial, and she recognizes to some degree that she was also a victim of the war. Okay, if we're talking about veterans of the war, in the 1980s, we can't overlook Mr. Stallone and Rambo. At the first of these, the First Blood Part 1, or just First Blood, he's a veteran who goes to meet a former comrade of his who he discovers has died from cancer due to exposure to Agent Orange, and a whole bunch of stuff happens, and he gets involved with the police and things, and eventually is sent away. The second movie, he's released to go to Vietnam to find MIAs, right, who are allegedly still being held. He does find them, but he has to fight. The government doesn't want him to find them. And this is where you get a real kind of paranoid, conspiratorial mindset, right? The blame is now imposed upon the government for leaving troops behind. And in my research, there's never been any MIA that were discovered. It's just a kind of popular mythology that persists. So I got a couple quotes up here, right? In these movies, there's this sense of what was interesting culturally to me about these movies was it was a way for us to come to grips with the war. These were hugely popular movies, the Rambo movies were, right? He says, do we get to win this time? The implication meaning that we didn't get to win last time because the government had one hand tied behind our backs, right? We had incorrect policies, et cetera. And at the end of the movie, he's asked by Richard Crenna, what do you want? And he says, I want what they want and every other guy who came over here and spilled his guts and gave everything he had wants, for our country to love us as much as we love it. That's what I want. And that does seem to be the central takeaway from the Vietnam War. I think it's the central lesson that people have learned from it is that we need to treat our veterans better. There was so much of this stuff in the 1980s, so just through some of this stuff, various books and movies and commercial goods that dealt with this kind of stuff. I asked my students in my 2 classes this semester, I gave them a quiz about the war. We hadn't talked about it at all. And one of the questions was, how were soldiers treated when they returned home? And that was, there was almost unanimous response to it. They were treated badly. Somebody actually said, that the soldiers were hated, disrespected, and called baby killers. But when I asked them other questions, like I asked them what My Lai was, which I hope most of you know, was a massacre where U.S. troops killed over 600 old men, women, and children, not a single person had heard of My Lai. I asked them questions, basic background questions like, I feel sorry for the historians in the room as I start talking about this, like who was the U.S. fighting against in Vietnam? And I had several students who said Japan, and some students who said Korea. What else? I listed the continents, and I said, in what continent was the Vietnam War fought? And I had a couple students who said it took place in the Middle East. Somebody said South America. What else? Oh, and the reason for the war, I didn't know this, but it was Pearl Harbor. And oil. Oil was another reason that the war was fought. But mostly there was ignorance about the war. And I also asked them, what movies, books, or films do you associate with the war? And there were the two most common, most people didn't have an answer to that. But the most common response was, the second most common response was Fortunate Son, the John Fogerty song, which surprised me because I thought that's not that well known a song. But then I did some digging, and it's the theme song in the Call of Duty video game set in Vietnam. So that's, somebody called that Fortunate Song instead of Fortunate Song. But the most popular, the most common response I got about cultural representations of the war was this movie, Forrest Gump. I was at a conference a few months ago about going to panels on war, and somebody said that, I couldn't believe the statistic. They said like 80% of high schools in the U.S. Showed Forrest Gump to their students. I have no way of knowing if that's true, but it does seem like it's commonly shown. I think most of you have probably seen this movie. I actually put off watching it for years. I just watched it in preparation for this because I knew it would piss me off. And it did. But it's interesting ideologically. This was the highest grossing American movie of 1994. The scenes in Vietnam are pretty revealing because of what's not revealed. In the scene in combat, what happens is the men are attacked, they're seriously wounded, Forrest Gump keeps on running back to save them, and he eventually receives the Medal of Honor for it. Every scene in Vietnam, whether it's in the scene in combat or prior to that, there's not a single Vietnamese that's depicted in the movie. It's like, you know, we can't deal with that because that raises all sorts of other stories about, is this really the enemy? It raises problems about atrocities committed by the U.S. In the scene where Gump and his men and his comrades are under attack, he's firing his weapon. He's firing his M16. He's literally firing it into the jungle. You never see anybody who's being fired at or who's hurt or who's shot, right? All you see him as Gump as a savior. That same kind of erasure happens later in the movie where he's on I think it's 1967, there's a protest march, and he's called up to speak, to give his impression about the war. Does anybody remember what happens? Yeah, the mic's cut off. So you don't hear him get to say anything about the war, right? Because the war is still, at this point, presumably too contentious, right? He can't have a point of view. Politics are completely removed from the movie, right? All we have is a veteran. That's what you remember from the movie, right? Gary Sinise, the veteran who's lost his legs, and Forrest Gump, who tries to help him. So I'll close with a quick discussion of a few novels, a few books about the war. The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien is probably the most lionized book about the war. It is actually taught sometimes in high schools. It's interesting. If you haven't read it, it's sort of a novel, but it's also a collection of short stories where these characters sort of appear and reappear, and incidents are referred to over and over again. I wrote about this in my book, and my take on it is it's about memory, about the process of memory and piecing things together, but it's about trying to make sense of traumatic memory, right? Going back to that same incident different times from different angles. I guess I probably won't take the time to read it. The first passage up there talks about a specific incident where a soldier literally drowns in a field of shit. And the second passage is O'Brien remembering that and thinking about it and trying to make some sense of it. I just read this book in preparation for this talk. this has become my favorite novel of the Vietnam War. It's The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. It won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize. It's really interesting because the central character is this kind of Mobius strip of identity. He's the son of a French Catholic priest and a Vietnamese woman. He eventually manages to get educated in the United States, gets a college education at Occidental College, majoring in American studies. He goes back to Vietnam. He's working as an agent for the North Vietnamese, but he's working as a South Vietnamese agent. Most of the novel takes place after the fall of Saigon, so he's in the United States, and he's keeping track of the South Vietnamese refugees, people who are still sympathetic to the South. So what's interesting about it is just this play on identity and this multiple sympathies that he has, and the fact that he's been educated in the United States makes him a really skillful commentator on American culture. So I'll just read two passages and then I'll end there. This is, he writes this narrative. He later goes back to Vietnam and he's held prisoner by the communist government, and he's got to write a confession, and that's the manuscript. Our country itself was cursed, bastardized, partitioned into North and South. We had not chosen to be debased by the French, to be divided by them, to be turned over to the great powers of capitalism and communism for further bisection. Then given roles as the clashing armies of a Cold War chess match played in air-conditioned rooms by white men wearing suits and lies. Just as my abused generation was divided before birth, so was I divided by birth, delivered into a postpartum world where hardly anyone accepted me for who I was, but only ever bullied me into choosing between two sides. This small world with its small-minded people, those mobs who treated a man with two minds and two faces as a freak, who wanted only one answer for any question. And then the last passage here is just him commenting on American movies, on Hollywood, which I thought was appropriate since I talk so much about movies. He's in the context of the novel, he's working as an advisor on a film about the Vietnam War. It's sort of like Apocalypse Now. I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. The ancillary benefit was strip mining history, leaving the real history in the tunnels along with the dead, doling out tiny sparkling diamonds for audiences to gasp over. This was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created. Movies were America's way of softening up the rest of the world. It mattered not what story these audiences watched. The point was that it was the American story they watched and loved up until the day that they themselves might be bombed by the planes they had seen in American movies. And if you want, we could finish with one more song from John. Would you like that? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.